The worst part wasn't being left out. The worst part was that I found out the same way you find out a package has been delivered, a notification, brief and impersonal, sent to the wrong person at the wrong moment. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my robe, pouring my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a group message. My son had added me to a thread called Christmas at the Lake. I smiled before I even opened it because my granddaughter had been talking about that lake house for weeks. My daughter-in-law's parents had just bought it, a 4-bedroom property up in Vermont, right on the water. My granddaughter had described the dock, the fireplace, the snowfall that apparently came early up there. I had already started thinking about what I might bring. I make a cranberry walnut bread every Christmas that my son has asked for since he was 9 years old. I opened the thread. There were photos of the house. Everyone was tagged. My daughter-in-law's mother, her father, her 2 sisters, her brother-in-law, my son, my granddaughter, a message from my daughter-in-law that said, "So excited for our first family Christmas together at the lake. December 23rd through the 27th. Can't wait to see everyone." I scrolled up, I scrolled down. I was not tagged. I had not been added to the thread. My son had forwarded it to me separately with a single line below it. He wrote, "Mom, just so you know, her family is doing a whole thing up there. It's their first Christmas with the new place and she wants it to be just her side. I hope you understand. We'll do something with you before we leave." I read it 3 times. I set my phone face down on the counter. I picked up my coffee. I looked out the window at the yard where the oak tree had already dropped most of its leaves. And I stood there for a long time without moving. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because I think a lot of people expect me to say I was devastated. And I was, but not in the way you might imagine. What I felt most was a very quiet, very specific recognition, like when you've been hearing a strange sound in the wall for months and you finally understand what it is. It wasn't shock. It was clarity. My son is 41 years old. He works in construction supply, runs a small distribution company he started 8 years ago. For the first 4 years, that company nearly broke him. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. There were months when he called me on a Sunday night barely holding it together. His inventory financing had fallen through. His largest client had delayed payment by 60 days and he was staring at payroll with nothing to cover it. My husband had passed 2 years before that. He left me the house which I sold and a life insurance policy that I had been careful with. I was 62 years old, living in a smaller apartment on the other side of town. And I had a sum of money that was meant to carry me through the rest of my life if I was wise about it. I invested $240,000 into my son's company, not a loan, or at least not the way most people use that word. We signed paperwork. I became a silent partner, 18% equity, no operational role, no salary. My son handled everything. I trusted him completely. He had his father's work ethic, and I believed in him the way only a mother can believe in something she helped build from the very first breath. The company recovered, more than recovered. In the last 3 years, it had grown to a point where my son was talking about expanding into 2 new states. He had hired a business attorney, a financial planner. He had leased a second warehouse. He had taken his wife and my granddaughter to Portugal that summer. And when they came back, my daughter-in-law had started talking about the Vermont property and weekend trips and a lifestyle that I quietly noted did not seem to include much space for me. I did not complain. That is important for you to understand. I am not a woman who complains easily. I grew up watching my own mother hold things together with nothing. And I absorbed her way of moving through difficulty without announcing it. I showed up. I babysat. I brought food. I sent cards. I drove 3 hours in a snowstorm the winter before to help when my granddaughter had her tonsils out because my daughter-in-law's mother had the flu and couldn't come. I sat in that hospital room for 11 hours and I drove home the same night because I had an early appointment the next morning and I didn't want to be a burden. I am telling you all of this not to make myself sound like a saint because I know I am not one. I am telling you because context matters, because when someone shows you who they are, the full picture of who you have been to them is part of what makes it legible. After I read my son's message, I put it out of my mind for the rest of that day. I had learned, somewhere in my 60s, that the first 24 hours after something hurts, you are not the right time to decide what it means. So, I went about my day. I went to the grocery store. I called my friend who lives 2 streets over and we walked for 45 minutes and talked about her sister's hip replacement and the book we were both reading. I came home and made soup and watched television and went to bed. In the morning, I called my son. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was in the office and not in the field. He sounded normal, a little rushed, the way he always is before 10 o'clock in the morning. I asked him directly. I said, I want to make sure I understand. For Christmas, it's her family only, and that means I'm not included. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mom, it's not a big deal. It's just you know how her mom is. She planned the whole thing and it's kind of a family bonding thing for them. It's nothing against you. I asked, will my granddaughter be there? He said, of course, yeah. I said, okay. And I meant it as a closing of the subject, not an acceptance of the terms. He said, we'll definitely do something before we leave. Maybe dinner on the 22nd? I said that would be fine. We hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a minute, and then I did something I had never done before in 8 years of being a silent partner in my son's business. I called the attorney who had drafted our original partnership agreement. His name was not one I had ever needed to call directly. My son handled all the legal correspondence, but I had kept his card in the small wooden box on my desk where I keep important things, and I found it without having to look hard. I made an appointment for the following Thursday. In between, something happened that I want to describe carefully because I think it is the part of this story that changed everything for me, not just what I did, but why. My son's company uses a shared cloud drive for financial documents. I had been given access years ago when we signed the partnership paperwork, and I had never used it for anything except to occasionally check the quarterly reports my son emailed me summaries of. I don't think he remembered I had direct access. I'm not sure I remembered either until that week when something made me look. I want to be honest, I don't know exactly what made me open that folder. Maybe it was the Christmas message. Maybe it was the way my son had said it's nothing against you in a tone that sounded like something had been rehearsed. Maybe it is simply what happens when you get old enough to recognize the specific silence that comes before something is taken from you. What I found was a folder I had not seen before. It had been created 4 months earlier. Inside it were 2 documents. The first was a draft restructuring agreement. The second was a memo from my son's business attorney outlining a proposed buyout of my equity stake at a valuation that was, to put it plainly, less than half of what an independent appraisal would have supported. The memo used the phrase retiring silent partner 3 times. I was 64 years old. I had never expressed any interest in retiring from anything. The documents were drafts. Nothing had been filed. Nothing had been signed, but they were not casual notes. They were detailed, formatted, clearly the result of multiple conversations and billable hours. I closed the laptop. I went for a walk. I walked for almost 2 hours through my neighborhood and then through the park where I sometimes sit by the fountain. And I thought about my son at 9 years old asking me to cut the crusts off his bread. And my son at 19 calling me from college because he was homesick and didn't want his roommate to hear him admit it. And my son at 30 holding his daughter for the first time with his hands shaking. I thought about my husband who would have known what to do in that moment. He always knew. He had a way of seeing the shape of things before they unfolded that I have spent 20 years trying to learn from him even after he was gone. And then I went home and I called the attorney again and I asked him to also pull together an independent appraisal of my equity stake. What he came back with 2 weeks later was a number that was significantly higher than the figure in the draft buyout memo. The company had grown. My 18% was worth considerably more than my son's attorney had suggested in that document. And because of the terms of the original agreement, terms my son and I had signed together, I had the right to request a buyout at fair market value at any time with 60 days notice, no approval required. I gave the 60 days notice on a Tuesday morning. I did not call my son first. I let the attorney send the formal notice the way the agreement specified. My son called me within 2 hours. He was not angry at first. He was confused. He said, Mom, what is this? Why you doing this now? I said, I've decided it's the right time. He said, you could have talked to me. We could have figured something out. I said, I know, and I left it there. There was a pause, then his voice changed slightly, and he said, is this about Christmas? I said, this is about my financial security. I'm 64 years old and I need to be thoughtful about my assets. He was quiet again. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "I never meant to make you feel left out." I said, "I know that too." We stayed on the phone a little longer, saying things that were true but not complete. Before we hung up, I told him I loved him, and I meant it the way you can mean something entirely and still know that it doesn't change what you have decided. The 60 days carried me right into early December. I had been living in my apartment for 2 years, and it had always been fine, clean, comfortable, close to things I needed. But I had been thinking for longer than I admitted to myself about what I actually wanted. Not what was convenient, not what was sensible. What I wanted. There is a small coastal town about 3 hours south of where I live. I had gone there once years ago with my husband. On a long weekend when our son was in middle school and staying with his grandmother, we had walked along the water every morning that trip and eaten dinner late and stayed up talking the way we hadn't in years. I had never forgotten it. With the buyout proceeds, I had options, real options. I started looking. I found a condominium on the second floor of a building 2 blocks from the water. It had a small balcony and afternoon light that came in through the west-facing window in a way that reminded me immediately of that weekend with my husband. The building had a community garden. There was a library 4 minutes away. The nearest coffee shop was run by a woman in her 70s who had moved there, she told me when I visited, because she was tired of living for other people's schedules. I put in an offer the first week of December. It was accepted 3 days later. My son did not know about any of this. We had spoken twice since the phone call about the buyout, once briefly about my granddaughter's school play. Once when he called to confirm dinner on December 22nd. Both conversations were polite, both were careful. The space between us had taken on a particular quality that I think both of us recognized but neither of us named. December 22nd came. We went to dinner, the 4 of us, my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, and me. My daughter-in-law was pleasant in the careful way she sometimes is, the way that is always communicated to me that she is managing something. My granddaughter showed me videos on her phone and made me laugh 3 times genuinely and held my hand when we walked back to the car. My son hugged me in the parking lot and said, "I'm glad we did this, Mom." I held on to him for a moment longer than usual. I did not tell them at dinner. I had decided I would not make an announcement because I wasn't making a statement. I was simply living. They left for Vermont the next morning. On December 23rd, I signed the closing paperwork for the coastal condominium. On December 24th, I drove down with my car packed. I won't describe that drive to you because I think you might expect me to say it was sad or triumphant or that I cried. What I actually felt was something quieter than any of those things. I felt like a woman driving toward her own life. The radio was on. There was a light rain that turned into no rain by the time I crossed the state line. I stopped once for coffee and stood outside the gas station for a few minutes, feeling the cold air and looking at the gray sky and thinking that gray skies in December are actually beautiful if you stop needing them to be blue. I arrived in the late afternoon. The light through the west window was exactly what I remembered. I set up my coffee maker first, the way I always do in a new place, then I unpacked my books. Then I put the photo of my husband on the shelf by the window where the light would reach it in the morning. I made myself dinner, pasta, simple, the kind I cook when I am alone and not performing domesticity for anyone. I poured a glass of red wine. I sat at the table on my balcony in my coat because it was cold, but I wanted to hear the water and I could hear it from there just barely if I was quiet enough. My granddaughter called me on Christmas morning from Vermont before the rest of the family was awake. She is 12 and she has her father's instincts for the people she loves. She said, "Grandma, where are you? It doesn't sound like your apartment." I told her I had moved. She said, "Where?" I told her the name of the town. She was quiet for a second, then she said, "Is it pretty?" I said, "It's very pretty." "There's water," she said. "Can I visit?" I said, "You can visit whenever you want. You are always welcome in my home." That is the moment, if I am honest, when I cried, not because it was sad, because it was true. Because I meant it in a way I hadn't been able to mean it in years without the complicated weight of everything I had been doing and giving and hoping someone would notice. My son called later that afternoon. He was outside, I could tell, away from the house. His voice was different from any other time we had spoken in the previous 2 months. He said, "Grandma told us you moved." I said, "I did." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "I'm telling you now." He was quiet. Then, Mom, are you okay? It was the first time he had asked me that in a long time, not how are you, the greeting, the reflex, actually asked. I said, I am more than okay. I am exactly where I want to be. He didn't say anything for a moment. I heard the wind on his end of the call, the sound of water somewhere. He was at a lake and I was at the ocean. And there was something almost funny about that if you looked at it a certain way. He said, I think I owe you an apology, a real one, not just for Christmas. I said, I know. He said, I don't know when I stopped. And then he stopped himself. I don't know when I started making you feel like you didn't matter. I want to tell you that I had a speech ready for this moment. I want to tell you I had something wise and perfectly formed to say, the kind of thing that ties a story together. But what I actually said was simpler than that. I said, you have always mattered to me. That doesn't mean you haven't hurt me. Both things are true at the same time. He said, yeah. And the way he said it told me he understood. We talked for another 20 minutes. He asked about the apartment. I told him about the balcony and the light and the woman who ran the coffee shop. He asked if I was lonely. I told him honestly that I wasn't, not yet, and I suspected not the way he meant. He told me about the lake and his daughter catching a fish off the dock that morning and how the snow had started the night before and was still coming down. Before we hung up, he said, can I bring her to visit you? In the spring, maybe? I said, yes, I would like that very much. In January, I joined the community garden. I don't know a great deal about gardening, but the woman 3 plots down from mine is patient and opinionated, and we have already had 2 arguments about tomato varieties that I have enjoyed enormously. On Tuesday mornings, I go to the library where there is a reading group that meets at 10 o'clock and argues about books with the kind of passion that I had forgotten civilians could have about literature. I have made 2 friends there that I think will become real ones. My son and I speak every week now. The conversations are different, still careful in places, but careful the way you are careful with something worth protecting, not careful the way you are careful with a performance. His wife and I are not close. I don't expect we will be, but she sent me a card in January with a photo of my granddaughter on the dock in Vermont, and inside she wrote, she talks about you all the time. I put it on the refrigerator. The buyout finalized in January. The number was fair. My attorney said it was more than fair. I have it invested now in a way that will take care of me properly for as long as I need it to. I do not lie awake thinking about money the way I did for the last several years when so much of what I had was tied to something I didn't control. I have been thinking lately about what I would tell a woman who is where I was 2 years ago, not where I was the morning of the Christmas message before that. The years of giving without asking, the slow accumulation of being treated like a resource rather than a person, the way you learn to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were not designed to hold you comfortably. I don't think I would tell her to give less. I don't think generosity is the problem. I gave because I wanted to, because I loved my son and I believed in him, and I would do most of it again knowing what I know. The giving was never the mistake. The mistake was believing that if I gave enough, I would not have to ask to be included, that if I made myself useful enough, I would eventually become indispensable in the way that cannot be set aside for a nicer invitation. It doesn't work that way. You cannot earn your way into being treated with dignity. Either someone sees your worth and acts accordingly or they don't, and no amount of cranberry walnut bread changes that calculus. What changed things was not the move or the buyout or any single decision. What changed things was the moment I understood that I was allowed to want things for myself. That 64 is not an age at which your own desires become irrelevant. That the life I had spent decades helping other people build did not have to be the only life I lived. My balcony faces west. In the evenings, when the light comes in low over the water, it turns everything gold for about 20 minutes. I have started making a habit of being outside for those 20 minutes every day, just watching. My husband would have loved it here. I talk to him sometimes when the building is quiet and there is nothing to perform for anyone. I tell him about the garden and the reading group and the way the coffee smells in the morning when the window is open slightly and the salt air comes in with it. I tell him I am fine, and I mean it in the full weight of the word, not fine as in managing, not fine as in surviving, fine as in present, rooted, quietly and stubbornly alive in a life that belongs entirely to me. The water is very beautiful in the mornings. It is the prettiest view I have ever had from any window. I am not leaving.